The Wolf Dog by Walt Morey. Chapter 7. George C. Hunter had built a palace-like home high in the hills above the city. Far below lay the pattern of the streets that led toward the concrete canyons of the city's core. The canyons pointed toward the bay where the commerce of the world came in by sea. Here hundreds of industries and warehouses lined the half-moon shore, and miles of docks reached into the bay. Some docks were lined with great ships from foreign ports. Others, called fishermen's wharves, were packed solid with fishing crafts of all kinds and sizes, idled here for the coming winter. Beyond the bay lay the distant blue line of the open sea. It was to this home George C. Hunter brought Kavik. The first day he proudly led the dog through the big hall into the immense living room. "Look, Edna," he called. "Here he is. This is Kavik. He didn't die after all. Isn't he marvelous? Isn't he some animal?" The woman looked at Kavik. She was tall and slender. Her blue eyes were chill, and her voice was sharp and unfriendly. "So this is the great dog. George, are you out of your mind? Bringing home an animal like that? I never heard of such a thing. Get him out of this house." "You don't understand," Hunter explained. "This is the dog that won the North American Sled Dog Derby at Fairbanks. He's part wolf, Edna. There isn't another dog like him in the country today. They don't breed these fellows any more." "I don't care what he is," the woman said angrily, "and I don't care what he's won. He looks like a wild animal to me, and I won't have him running through this house, breaking up furniture, imported glassware and antiques, and muddying up floors." "He's not breaking anything or muddying up anything," Hunter said stiffly. "He will if you take that chain off him. This is a home, George, not a museum for all the junk you drag back here from the great North. I've put up with the elephant tusk you dug up at that mine, the bows and arrows, the walrus tusks, that two-hole canoe thing, snowshoes, parkas, and the old Russian guns you found. But I will not stand for you bringing wild animals into the house." "Animal," Hunter corrected. "There's only one, and Kavik's not wild." "He looks wild to me," the woman insisted, "and all the rest of your collection began with one. If you want to keep this brute, you put him in that run you had built, and keep him there." George C. Hunter said quietly, "All right, Edna, all right." He took Kavik back outside and put him in the wire and concrete-floored run he'd had built in the backyard. Kavik lay in a corner of the 6x10 enclosure, day after day, big head on four paws, yellow eyes staring out over the city and over the bay to the distant line of the sea, staring toward the north. This was a strange and frightening world into which Kavik had been brought. The threshing umbrella of sound that hung over the city drifted up to him. From the bay came the occasional deep-throated bellow of a great ship entering or leaving the harbor. Some of the sounds were repeated all day and half the night on the road in front of the house. At regular intervals, planes roared over him, the thunder of their passing shaking the earth. The deep silences he had known all his life were gone. There was only, at rare intervals, a little less sound. His freedom of movement was now confined to a 6x10-foot concrete and wire enclosure. There was no boy to meet each night, to race wildly home through the trees with him, no kitchen with its delicious odors, no family sitting about a table talking in low voices, no bedroom where he slept night on a rug at the head of a boy's bed. The very air he breathed here was different. He missed the clean, sweet smell of the tundra, the fresh, biting tang of the open sea. The air was heavy with acrid fumes from 1,000 different sources. They irritated his delicate nostrils. The voice and the smell of this strange world reacted on two of his strongest senses, his hearing and his sense of smell. The same fear he had known when he'd been placed in the iron cage and shoved into the mysterious darkness of Smiley Johnson's plane came alive within him again, and never left. Even the people who came to see him were different. They'd stand outside his run, hold their hands behind their backs as though they expected at any moment to have one bitten off, and stare at him. "He sure is different," they'd say. "He doesn't look like he's got any dog in him. A real wolf, that's what he looks like. I'll bet he's all wolf. I'd sure hate to have those big teeth after me." Sometimes George Hunter would enter the pen and pet him just to show his friends that Kavik was tame. They'd go away talking among themselves and telling George Hunter he was foolish to keep such a vicious-looking animal around. But no one ever spoke to Kavik. Not one of the many who came to stare ever put forth a friendly hand to pet him. Then Tom McCarty returned from the funeral of a relative, and Kavik found one friend. McCarty was a lean, tough old man with a permanent limp. His leg had been crushed in a cave-in at George Hunter's mine 10 years ago. McCarty had been with Hunter ever since the little man first went north to seek his fortune working in the mine, so Hunter took him south to work around his home as a gardener and handyman. Few knew about this side of Hunter, and he tried to hide it even from himself. "We need somebody to work around the place," he told his wife. "Mac can do it as well as anybody else, and he comes a lot cheaper." Tom McCarty had his own comfortable quarters above the big double garage. He kept the cars cleaned and polished, mowed the lawn, trimmed the shrubs, weeded the flower beds, and dreamed of his younger days in the far north. The first time Tom McCarty saw Kavik lying in a corner of the wired-in run, big head on forepaws, yellow eyes staring out over the city and the bay, his heart went out to him. In the past he had worked countless times behind such animals. In weather so cold a man could freeze to death in minutes if he stood still. He unlatched the gate, went inside, and squatted on his heels before Kavik. Unhesitatingly he reached out, scratched at the roots of the dog's ears, and said gently, "Hello, big fella. You and me, we're two of a kind." Kavik's yellow eyes came back from that great distance and looked into the bright gray eyes of the old man. "You don't belong in this cage or in this country any more'n I do. A blind man could see that. We're outsiders, you and me. We belong up there where the wind howls across the tundra and snow flies, where your ancestors run the ridges and where I could walk for a month and never see a living soul, before I had this gimp leg, that is. Me, I got no choice but to live down here with my gimp leg. But they took your choice away from you. So here we are." Tom McCarty reached forth a big rough hand, lifted Kavik's paw, and gravely shook it. You're a breath of God's own country, big fella. I'm right glad to meet you." Kavik's tail thumped the concrete, and Tom McCarty smiled. "That's more like it. Let's have no more of this moping, eh? It don't buy you a thing down here." But as the days passed, Kavik continued to mope. He was still a big, healthy-looking animal, but his wolf-gray coat no longer had quite the same bright sheen. His sharp ears were down flat to his head, and his eyes were not clear and interested in all that went on. George Hunter noticed. He stood before the enclosure and scowled at Kavik lying in a corner. "Mac," he called to McCarty, his voice sharp and annoyed. "What's wrong with Kavik? All he does is lie there in that corner and stare out. You know all about these northern dogs. What's eating him?" McCarty had been waiting for this. He knew just how far he dared go in crossing Hunter, and he went right up to it now. "He's homesick and he's lonesome, Mr. Hunter. He's been here more than a month. It's time he got over that. Anything else?" "There's another thing that would help." "What's that?" "Get him out of that pen once in a while. He's a working dog, remember? Dogs like him are used to lots of exercise and plenty of room to run. Cooped up in a pen like that is no good for him. Exercise would do him a world of good. His appetite would improve, and his coat would come back some." "Exercise, eh?" George Hunter was not one to prolong acting on a decision. "We've got 2 acres of ground here, and it's all fenced so he can't get away. Let him out, Mac." "Here? Now?" "Certainly." McCarty opened the gate and stood aside. Kavik looked at the open gate, then up at McCarty, and walked out. He stood uncertainly looking about, not understanding this sudden freedom. McCarty waved his arm, taking in the house and 2 acres of yard. "Go on, big fella," he said. "Have at it. Mush, mush. Eat up that trail." Kavik trotted off a few feet and smelled a rhododendron bush. The soft grass beneath his feet felt good after the weeks of concrete run away. He trotted on. It was wonderful to stretch his legs again, to feel the spring in his muscles and the softness of the earth beneath his feet. Suddenly he burst into a full stride, raced through a rhododendron hedge, and came to the 5-foot fence. He turned along the fence at top speed, raced around a towering fir tree, burst through a stand of shrubbery, reached the next fence corner, and turned again, following it. It was a gray-white shadow streaking through shrubbery and across flower beds, running low to the ground, bushy tail stretched out, running as his wolf ancestors had run for centuries, and with their tremendous speed. His sharp ears were forward, his mouth open, sucking in great gulps of air. He was enjoying every lunging stride. He made a complete circuit of the yard, seeming to flow over the ground. Flower stems snapped, plants ripped at his passing. Then he heard the shrill voice of the woman, high and angry. "George! Mac! Stop him! Get that wolf out of here! He's ruining the yard! Get him out! Get him out right now!" McCarty hobbled to cut off the racing Kuvik. "Whoa!" he shouted. "Whoa! Whoa, big fella!" George Hunter ran from the opposite direction, trying to corner him. At McCarty's voice, Kavik came to a panting stop, ears cocked forward, studying the old man. "Come here, big fella." McCarty snapped his fingers. "Come on, the party's over." He held out his hand and walked up to Kavik and twisted his fingers in the thick ruff of his neck. We're going to get in serious trouble and lose our happy home if you bust down any more shrubbery," he said in a low, soothing voice. Patting the dog, he led him back to the wire enclosure and locked him in. "Of all the stupid things to do," the woman railed, "turning that brute loose in this yard. Just look what he's done. Look at it." "I know, Edna," Hunter soothed. "Mac'll fix it up tomorrow. I didn't realize the dog would take off this way. I won't let him out again." "Well, I certainly hope not." The woman turned on her heel and went back into the house, muttering angrily under her breath. "I guess you'd better clean up these beds and get rid of the broken limbs tomorrow," Hunter said to McCarty. "And we can't let Kavik out again. But you're right, he needs exercise. Man, wasn't he a sight? I'll get a chain with a snap ring, and you can take him walking every day. I don't want a leather collar on him. It'd wear the hair off his neck and spoil his ruff." He looked at the dog thoughtfully. "He seems to like you, Mac. Maybe if you spent some extra time with him besides the walking, it'd help him get over being lonesome and homesick. And he'd look a little sharper. Take him up to the apartment with you or anything else you'd like. Just don't let him loose again," he said wryly. Thereafter, Tom McCarty took Kavik for a walk every day it didn't rain. They'd go up the hill because the street ended within 2 blocks, and that was about as far as McCarty would walk without resting. McCarty would sit on a log, stretch his bad leg before him, and look out at the bay below and the distant sea. Kavik would sit beside him, yellow eyes searching far beyond the bay and the sea, looking always toward the north. Tom McCarty would pat the big head and say, "You might as well forget it, big fella. It's a long way by boat or plane, farther than you could ever go. So quit breaking your heart over something that can't be." Kavik listened to the old man's gentle voice, cocking his head first one way and then another. At the end, he placed a paw on McCarty's knee, where the man patted it. McCarty lifted the paw and shook it gravely. "It does no good to tell you this," he said, "but believe me, I know." When it rained, McCarty took Kavik to his quarters above the garage. There he'd take the chain off him and let him run free. In his first inspection, Kavik's delicate nose snuffed out the parka hanging in the closet. The parka had been made by an Eskimo woman, and even now a faint aroma clung to it that pricked Kavik's nostrils. He thrust his nose against the thick fur and woofed loudly. "You know what that is, eh?" McCarty took out the parka and slipped into it and stood before the mirror. "I brought this parky down with me 10 years ago. Wore it just once. We had a little old inch or two of snow, and I slipped it on and went outside. Everybody looked at me like I was some kind of freak, and I've never worn it since." He studied his reflection critically. "Was 20 pounds heavier then and trail hard." He sighed and took off the parka. "Know what you need down here in the winter?" he asked. "Rubber boots, a rain slicker, and a sou'wester hat. Now ain't that a fine outfit for the likes of you and me?" Winter came, but not as Kavik had known winter. It was drizzling rain that lasted for days, with the sun peeking through for a few hours at odd intervals. During one of these sunny days, George Hunter decided that he would take Kavik for his walk. "I want to get him more used to me," he explained to Tom McCarty. "I'm going to make a speech on Alaska soon, and show my slides. I brought some of Kavik's of winning the North American. I want to tell him about him. Then I want him there so people can see him in the flesh. That ought to give them a thrill, eh, Mac?" "It sure ought to, Mr. Hunter," McCarty agreed. A few minutes later, Hunter strode out of the yard with Kavik on the chain, trotting dutifully at his heels. McCarty spent the time Hunter and Kavik were gone cleaning up around the pen in the yard. He was still at this when Hunter returned, walking fast. The little man's face was stormy, and his thin lips were pressed tightly together. Kavik trotted obediently at his heels, head down, plumed tail dropping. Hunter went straight to the enclosure, shoved Kavik inside, unsnapped the chain from his neck, and slammed the door. He whirled on McCarty, black eyes snapping, his voice cutting. "Did you know about him?" "Know what?" "That he's the biggest coward on earth. That's a good-sized chipmunk can run him to death." McCarty glanced at Kavik. "I don't believe it." "Listen, Mac." Hunter was as savagely angry. "You know that long white house at the end of the block? Well, they've got a dog there. As we went past, he came tearing out, barking his head off." "What kind of a dog?" McCarty asked. "How should I know? Just a dog, a little more than half as big as Kavik, I guess. Well, I thought Kavik would eat him alive. He could have, Mac, but did he? Oh, no," he said bitterly. "He almost tore the chain out of my hand, trying to get away. When he couldn't, he tried to hide behind me. He actually lay down on the sidewalk, Mac. Can you feature that? A man finally came out and called the dog off." Hunter shook his head. "That great big tough-looking wolf lying there on the sidewalk, whimpering. It was humiliating, Mac, humiliating. You never ran into him with that with him?" We always went the other way, up to the end of the street. There's no dogs up there." McCarty glanced at Kavik, lying in a corner of the cage, and looking as if he knew he'd disgraced himself and Hunter. "I just can't believe it." "I can," Hunter said. "I saw it, and Kurt Evans at the cannery tried to tell me how he was, but I wouldn't believe him. Kurt said the beating he took in the plane wreck knocked all the courage out of him. Well, something did." Hunter scowled at Kavik. "I paid $2,000 for that dog, and he's not worth a plug nickel. 2 weeks from now, he's the star attraction when I show these slides and make that speech at the club. How can I show a thing like that? Why, I'd be the laughing stock." "No, you won't," McCarty said. "Nobody needs to know. There won't be any other dogs there to scare him. You wouldn't have known today if you hadn't run into another dog that showed fight. Let him sit up there with you and take his bows. They'll never guess." Hunter considered that possibility. "It could work at that. You could hold him outside until I'm ready for him. Then I'll take him in. He won't have to be in the room more than 10 or 15 minutes while I make my little speech about him, and everybody gets a good look at him." "Yeah, it'll work." Hunter's voice turned tough. "Then I'm getting rid of him. Quick." "But he's still a nice dog," McCarty pointed out. "He looks like a big part-wolf sled dog. He makes a good show, and that's what you want him for, isn't it?" Hunter shook his head. "Sooner or later, somebody will find out what he's like, and then I'll feel like a fool. He's a cripple, Mac. A mental cripple. That's lots worse than if he had only 3 legs. You can feel sorry for a 3-legged dog because there's nothing you can do about it. But a coward, Mac?" he said bitterly. "Who feels sorry for a coward? Especially a big, tough-looking one like him. There's no excuse for being a coward. None at all. Look at him, big and strong and beautiful, and he grovels and whines. I won't have it. It's $2,000 down the drain, but he goes. That's final. I'll call off the show if I could, but you could get him brushed up and looking as good as possible for the club members. I don't even want to see him again." Tom McCarty prepared Kavik for the night of what he called Hunter's one-man show. The day of the show, he took Kavik to his quarters above the garage to groom him. After finishing, he stood back and studied the dog. "You look fine, big fella," he said. "Big and strong with plenty of good beef on your frame. Hard muscles, big chest, fine posture. You look like the lead dog that won the North American, all right. Nobody'd ever guess." He took the dog's big head in his hands and said, "I've got an idea what happened to you, and I understand. He don't. I'd like to keep you around, big fella, but Mr. Hunter won't have it. He's a mighty proud man, and he's got himself out on a limb with all his big talk about you." Kavik twisted his head, listening to the sound of McCarty's gentle voice. He put his paw on the old man's knee, and McCarty smiled and shook it again. "You're getting pretty good at that," he said. "Well, let's go. You'll knock these city lads dead tonight." Mr. Hunter's club was small and exclusive. It was situated in a grove of big trees well back in the hills above the city. Tom McCarty held Kavik in an outer room while the banquet was in progress, and George Hunter showed his slides. Then Hunter came out and said, "All right, Mac, we're ready for the vicious brute." He took the chain from McCarty's hand. "You might as well wait in the car. I won't keep him long." He led Kavik into the room full of people and up on a small platform. There he removed the chain and ordered the dog to sit. Kavik sat on his tail, yellow eyes narrowed, and looked out over the sea of faces. George Hunter began to talk, telling about Kavik and his life in the North, his bloodlines, part wolf and Malamute. He told about the North American Sled Dog Derby and what it took to be a good lead dog and how important he was to winning a race. The room was warm. The air was heavy and oppressive with tobacco smoke. Kavik began to pant. He turned his head. There was a window near the platform. His sharp ears shot forward. His yellow eyes opened wide and his big jaws snapped shut. He rose to his feet, his whole body tense. Throughout the room, people began nudging each other and smiling and whispering, "Look, he's posing, putting on a real show, just as if he knew George is talking about him. What a ham actor!" Kavik was not putting on a show. It was a bright moonlit night, and through the window he could see a massive bulk of mountains rising against the pale sky. Flowing down those mountain slopes like a loose cape thrown over them was a forest. It looked wild and primitive. It looked like the mountains of his far northern home. Tonight there was no chain to hold him back. He didn't hear what George Hunter's sharp, "Down, Kavik! Sit! Sit, I say!" He took 2 quick steps, muscles bunched, and launched his 100 pounds through the air. He struck the window and burst through with a tremendous crash of breaking glass and startling shouts. Kavik landed on the soft earth amid a shower of glass, gathered himself, and streaked into the protection of the bushes beside the building. He heard doors slam as people rushed outside. Voices called. He heard George Hunter's angry voice, and Belly crawled to the opposite side of the brush and sneaked away. He came to a high stone wall and turned, following it, hunting a way out. Men, searching, came close, beating through the shrubbery, calling, "Here, Kvik! Here, boy! Come, Kvik! Come on!" He made a running leap at the wall and fell back feet short of the top. Another party of searchers came near, and he began to run in fear. It was bright moonlight, and he dared not show himself. He took advantage of every shrub, rosebush, and tree to keep hidden. He was slinking now in typical wolf fashion, trying to avoid detection. He was a gray shadow crouching behind a tree until a man beat past. He was a faint whisper of sound as he slipped through a rhododendron hedge on another man's heels. He was part of the rock itself as he crouched in the deep shadow of a boulder as a party went by, calling and beating the shrubbery. Finally he crept through a laurel hedge and edged his way along in its shadows. He was heading for the big front gate. The gate was closed. A group of men, led by George Hunter, came threshing toward him. The rock wall on either side closed in to form a narrow opening to the gate. He was trapped. Tom McCarty got out of the car parked nearby, hobbled forward, and looked down at Kvik, crouched in the shadows of the laurel hedge. He looked up at the approaching men and called, "Mr. Hunter, do you better check that wall out back. There's a lot of brush for him to hide out in there, and the wall is pretty low. He might be able to jump it." "All right, Mac," Hunter answered. "We'll check the shrubbery and the wall right away. You'll keep an eye out here." The search party turned away. McCarty watched them leave, then said softly to Kvik, "All right, big fella, they're gone. You can come out now." He bent and snapped his fingers and coaxed, "Come on, this is old Mac. You know me." Kvik rose stealthily, and crept to him. McCarty squatted on his heels before the dog and scratched his ears and patted his big head. "So, you didn't like him in there and decided to leave him in a hurry. Fact is, you don't like it down here no more'n I do, but you're doing something about it, and I can't. I know where you want to go, but it's farther than you'll ever get. It's more than 2,000 miles of water and mountains and snow and ice and rivers and Lord knows what else. No dog on earth could have covered that distance. I'd talk you out of it, if I could, but I know you'll try. You'll wind up someplace, maybe even dead. That would be better for the likes of you than staying here." Kvik cocked his head and studied the old man's face and listened to the gentle words he could not understand, but he did understand the voice and its notes of sadness and longing. He put a paw on McCarty's knee, and the man lifted the paw and gravely shook it. "You know a lot, an awful lot. We had some mighty fine talks, didn't we? You let an old man dream about his past, and you were gentleman enough to listen and not interrupt. I thank you for that. But it's over now." He glanced up, listening. "They'll be coming back soon. You better be on your way." He rose and swung the gate open. He waved his hand outside. "There it is, what you've been waiting for. And wanting since the day you got here. It's all yours now. Go get it, big fella. Mush, mush, eat up that trail." Kvik walked through the gate. Outside he stopped and looked back. "Goodbye," the old man called softly, "and good luck." Tom McCarty closed the gate carefully and stood looking at the spot of thick brush beside the road where the wolf-gray form had vanished. Then he sighed and hobbled back to the car.